When a royal guard breaks the rules to save a life, the whole nation must decide what true honor really means. A cold morning breeze swept through the grand courtroom in London, where the tall wooden doors had just opened to the public. People in suits and military uniforms filled the benches, their faces full of curiosity and judgment. Whispers floated around the room as all eyes turned toward one man standing silently near the front, dressed not in a civilian suit, but in the red and black uniform of the Royal Guard. His name was Thomas Blake. He stood straight, his face calm, his eyes staring ahead as though nothing could shake him. But inside the room, tension hung heavy like a storm, waiting to break. Thomas Blake was not an ordinary guard. For years, he had stood outside Buckingham Palace, guarding the royal family. With quiet pride, his posture had never faltered, not even when tourists made jokes, waved cameras in his face, or tried to make him laugh. He had earned the highest respect among his fellow guards, and even more, he had been awarded the Medal of Honor for bravery. In the line of duty, yet today he was not being celebrated. He was being questioned, judged, possibly disgraced. At the judge's bench sat Lord Reginald Ashbury, a man known for his sharp tongue and rigid ideas about rules. He had spent his whole life believing that duty was above emotion, law above instinct. He looked at Blake with a cold expression. "This courtroom is not a place for emotion," he said firmly. "We are here to discuss an act of insubordination, break-in military protocol committed by one who should have known better." The room was silent. Even the sound of breathing seemed to stop. Blake remained still, his hands behind his back. Showing no sign of fear or protest, the charges were clear. A few weeks earlier, during the changing of the guard ceremony outside Buckingham Palace, Blake had done something shocking. He had left his post without permission. He had broken formation. And for what? To help an old woman who had collapsed just outside the gates. While the crowd had gasped, and some had applauded his action, others had recorded it. The videos had gone viral within hours. Some praised him as a hero. Others criticized him for abandoning his duty. Military officials had taken the matter seriously. They said tradition must be protected. Rules must be followed. Guards were not allowed to move unless ordered to do so. That was the pride of the Royal Guard. Unshaken, unmoved, unbreakable. And now, Judge Ashbury was expected to pass a sentence. But first, he wanted to hear from the man himself. "You have been awarded the highest honor for bravery," the judge said, his voice echoing in the hall. "Yet today, I am being asked to strip you of that honor. You have not spoken a word in your defense." Why? Blake didn't move. For a long moment, it seemed like he might not answer at all. Then, in a calm and respectful voice, he said, "Because I did what I believed was right. That is all." Murmurs spread across the room. Some people looked impressed by his calmness. Others shook their heads in disbelief. To many, this simple answer was not enough. Not to a judge like Ashbury, who demanded explanations, reasons, and rules to be obeyed. "Right is a matter of opinion, Guardsman Blake," the judge said sharply. "Military duty is not based on opinion. It is based on discipline. You know, that—" Blake remained silent again. His face was unreadable, like a stone wall. But behind those eyes was a sea of memories, pain, reasons he chose not to share, at least not yet. In the audience sat several soldiers who had served with Blake in the army before he became a Royal Guard. They knew a different version of him, a man who had once carried a wounded child for miles in a war zone, a man who had treated injured civilians under gunfire, a man who had never hesitated when someone's life was at risk. But none of those stories had been told in this courtroom. Yet, all that the judge knew was that this was a soldier who had broken a rule in front of the palace gates. A military official stood up to speak. "The image of the Royal Guard must remain untouchable," he said with firmness. "What happened?" "That day was an embarrassment. The world saw one of our finest guards break formation. Even if it was for an old woman, he acted without orders. If we allow this once, we weaken our discipline forever." The judge nodded slightly as if he agreed. Then he looked back at Blake. "You will remove your Medal of Honor and place it." "Before this court," he said. The room gasped. A reporter in the back dropped her pen. No one had expected the judge to move this quickly or to be so harsh, but Blake did something unexpected. He stepped forward slowly, reached inside his coat, and pulled out the medal. Then, instead of placing it down in anger or shame, he set it gently on the table like a precious thing, full of meaning. "I never wore this for praise," he said quietly. It was never about recognition. Something about his voice made people listen. It wasn't loud, but it had weight. It carried the sound of someone who had seen things others hadn't, the kind of voice that comes from witnessing war, saving lives, and feeling pain too deep for words. The judge watched him carefully. Maybe for the first time he started to wonder if there was more to this man than just a broken rule. "You still believe what you did was right?" the judge asked. Blake looked him straight in the eye. "Yes, your lordship, I'd do it again." There was a long pause. It wasn't just silence. It was the kind of pause where time seems to freeze, where people forget to breathe. Even the judge felt it. He looked down at the medal on the table. He had sentenced hundreds of men and women in his lifetime. But something about this case felt different. He couldn't put his finger on it yet, but a strange feeling had begun to grow in his chest. Was it doubt, curiosity, or something more personal? The session was paused for the day, and the courtroom slowly emptied. Reporters rushed to file stories. Soldiers shook their heads, confused. Some muttered that the law had no heart. Others whispered that rules were made to be broken for the right reasons. Outside the court, people gathered to see Blake. But he didn't stop for photos or interviews. He walked silently to a small, cheap hotel nearby, alone. As he sat on his bed that night, he opened a small leather wallet and pulled out an old photograph. It showed a younger version of himself, smiling. Beside an old woman with kind eyes, his mother. She had died years ago after collapsing at a bus stop. No one had helped her in time. That moment had shaped his life, his choices, and his silence. Back at the judge's residence, Lord Ashbury sat alone in his study, sipping tea he didn't really taste. He opened the file on Blake again, looking at his military history.
Words
like bravery, sacrifice, and selfless under fire filled the pages. But something caught his eye now that he hadn't noticed before. Blake's mother had died from a heart attack in public. He began to wonder if that moment was connected to the guard's actions. For the first time in years, the judge didn't sleep well. His mind replayed the calm voice of Thomas Blake, the look in his eyes, and the way he placed the medal on the table, not with pride, but with meaning. He began to feel something unusual, a desire to know the full story. And so what had begun as a simple case of rule-breaking was now turning into something deeper, something more human, something that could change how the judge, and perhaps the country, saw not just Thomas Blake, but what true honor really meant. Would you like me to now continue with part 2 in the same 2,500-word, simple and interesting English style? The morning of the royal ceremony had begun like any other. The skies above Buckingham Palace were clear, and the sounds of distant horses' hooves echoed on the old cobblestone streets. Crowds had already started to gather along the black-and gold palace gates, waiting for the traditional changing of the guard. It was a ceremony that had taken place for centuries, drawing both tourists and loyal citizens. Some had been there since sunrise, just to get the best spot. Cameras were ready, children sat on their parents' shoulders, and the buzz of excitement filled the air. Inside the palace grounds, everything was being done with military precision. Every shoe was polished, every rifle inspected. The guards stood tall, straight, and silent. Among them was Thomas Blake, the man whose face would soon be on every newspaper and screen in the country. At that moment, however, he was just another soldier in line, focused on the routine that had become second nature. His face didn't move, his eyes didn't wander. He was in position, dressed in his formal red uniform. Wearing the same tall bearskin hat as the others, the band started playing. The ceremony had begun. Like clockwork, the guards moved in sync. Tourists watched in awe as soldiers performed the complex steps without speaking a word. It was tradition, discipline, and honor, all displayed within a 15-minute performance. The world admired the Royal Guard for their unshakable discipline, their stillness, their silence. They were trained never to move, no matter what happened around them. But that morning, something unexpected happened. Outside the gate, in the middle of the cheering crowd, a soft moan was heard. It was barely noticeable at first. People turned their heads. An old woman had collapsed near the front row. Her body went limp and she fell to the ground. A man beside her shouted for help. Another screamed, "She's not breathing!" Joyful cheers turned into gasps. A young girl cried out, pulling on her father's sleeve. People moved aside, creating a small circle around the unconscious woman. Someone called an ambulance, but everyone knew it would take time to get through. The traffic. And inside the gate, only 10 steps away, stood Thomas Blake, still as a statue. He saw everything. The woman fall, saw the panic, heard the cries. Yet his heart skipped a beat, and for a second, memories came rushing back his mother's face, the moment she collapsed in the street, the sound of people walking past as she lay helpless. That pain never left him. And now, before him, it was happening again. He could not move. He was not supposed to. Protocol was clear: stay still. Wait for orders. Ignore the crowd. But Blake didn't wait. Without a word, he broke formation. His boots moved swiftly across the pavement. He opened the palace gate, crossed into the crowd, and knelt beside the woman. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. He checked her pulse. It was faint. The crowd parted further, stunned to see a royal guard, one of the Queen's own. Breaking the centuries-old rules, he took off his bearskin hat, placed it gently beside him, and loosened the woman's collar. He tilted her head back, began CPR. His hands moved with steady confidence. He had been a medic once, long before standing in the palace yard. The world might have forgotten, but his training had not. An American tourist filmed the moment on her phone. Her voice could be heard in the video. "This guard just moved. He's helping her." People clapped, cheered, some even cried. No one had seen anything like it. Other guards stood frozen in their positions, unsure what to do. The band stopped playing. The ceremony, for the first time in years, had been interrupted. Blake continued giving CPR, ignoring the noise, ignoring the stares. After a minute that felt like forever, the woman's chest rose. She took a breath. Her eyes fluttered open. An ambulance arrived shortly after, and paramedics took over. Blake stood back, picked up his hat, and silently returned through the gate back to his post. He did not speak. He did not smile. His face was as calm as it had been before, but outside the gate, the world had changed. The video of Blake's actions spread across the internet within hours. News outlets in the UK, the US, and across Europe replayed the footage again and again. Social media exploded. Some called him a hero. Others criticized him. "Protocol is protocol," said one commentator. "Rules must be followed." What if someone used that moment to cause harm? Others argued, he saved a life. That's what a real soldier does. Military leaders were not pleased. They believed his actions, though kind-hearted, showed weakness and discipline. It embarrassed the institution in front of thousands. Letters were written. Reports were filed. And soon, a formal inquiry was opened. A courtroom was arranged. Blake was summoned to appear. He was told that he could be stripped of his honors and dismissed from the service. Through it all, Blake said nothing. He refused all interviews. His commanding officer asked him why he hadn't defended himself. He simply said, "I did what I had to do." For those who knew Blake's history, the silence made sense. Years ago, during his early service, Blake had been stationed in a dangerous part of Afghanistan. He had seen explosions, gunfire, injured children, and grieving mothers. He had risked his life pulling wounded men from burning vehicles. Once, during a firefight, he ran across open ground to reach a downed pilot, ignoring orders to stay in cover. That act had earned him the Medal of Honor. But when asked about it, he always said it wasn't bravery. It was the right thing. After the war, he had returned to civilian life quietly. He didn't enjoy the attention. He didn't like being called a hero. He applied to become a Royal Guard, not because of the honor, but because it gave him peace, structure, and a place where silence was respected. And now, that silence had become the reason he was being judged. In the days leading up to the court hearing, the debate grew louder. Veterans came forward, sharing stories of Blake's bravery. A woman who once saw him donate blood to save a dying child in Syria wrote an article titled, "He saved lives when others hid." It went viral. The woman he had saved at the palace spoke publicly for the first time. "I would not be here if not for him," she said tearfully. "If that's wrong, then what kind of world do we live in?" Still, the military stood firm. One general stated, "If every guard breaks formation for personal judgment, we lose control." He may have saved a woman this time, but what if it creates a new habit? What if others follow his example during a security threat? Blake never replied to the criticism. He spent his time alone, away from the noise, walking in quiet parks, reading old books, remembering faces from the past, faces of the injured, the grateful, the forgotten. On the day before the court case, a royal advisor contacted him privately. It was said that someone high in the royal family had been watching the news closely. No names were given, no promises made. But the message was clear. Not everyone in power agreed with the trial. That night, as he sat alone in his small room, Blake looked at the old medal lying on his desk. He remembered how it had felt to receive it, the weight of it, the silence in the room, the salute. But he also remembered his mother's face, remembered the moment he stood over her lifeless body, wishing someone had stopped to help. That pain had never healed. It had simply taught him to act differently when his turn came. He went to bed early, slept with a calm mind. He had no speeches prepared, no defense written down, didn't need one. He knew what he had done. He knew why he had done it, and tomorrow he would stand before a judge not to be defended, but to be understood. Would you like me to continue with part 3 in the same 2,500-word, simple and interesting English style? The day of the court hearing arrived. It was early morning, and a light fog covered the city like a soft white sheet. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered with cameras, microphones, and notepads. Everyone was waiting to catch a glimpse of the man whose silent actions had shaken one of the oldest traditions in the country. People whispered his name, Thomas Blake. Some called him a hero, others called him reckless. But everyone was watching. Inside the courtroom, the mood was heavy and serious. The large wooden benches were filled with people from the military. Legal officials, journalists, and even a few royal advisors seated quietly in the back. At the center of the room stood the Judge Lord Reginald Ashbury, a man known for his strict belief in law and order. His face showed no emotion, but deep inside, he was curious about what he would hear today. He had read every report, studied every rule, and memorized the details of the case. Yet he still didn't fully understand the man who stood at the heart of this storm. Thomas Blake entered the courtroom, wearing his uniform, though the medal had already been taken from him days earlier. His steps were quiet but firm. He walked with dignity, not pride. His face was calm. He didn't look around or react to the flashing cameras or the whispers from the benches. He simply took his place and stood tall, just as he had outside the palace gates so many times before. The trial began. The courtroom clerk read the charges out loud, breaking military protocol during official duty, abandoning posts without orders, and risking the integrity of the royal guard. Each charge felt heavy, as if accusing him not just of breaking rules, but of breaking the very image of tradition. Then the military prosecutor stood. He was a sharp man with a strong voice. "This is not a case about kindness," he said. "It is a case about discipline. The Royal Guard is a symbol of national pride. It is respected around the world for its silence, its strength, and its complete loyalty to duty. When one man breaks formation, even for good reason, it damages everything we stand for." He pointed at Blake. "What he did may seem noble, but if we allow every soldier to act on personal feelings, where will it end? Guards must not act on emotion, they must act on command." The judge nodded slowly, as if agreeing, then he turned to Blake. Do you have anything to say in your defense? The courtroom fell completely silent. Everyone waited. Blake remained still for a moment. Then he looked at the judge and spoke in a soft but clear voice. I have no defense, sir. I only have the truth. People leaned forward in their seats. He continued, I saw an old woman collapse. I knew the ambulance would take time. I was trained to save lives. I used that training. That's all. The judge raised an eyebrow. So you admit that you disobeyed your orders? Yes, your lordship, Blake said. I did. Then why should this court show you mercy? Blake paused. His hands were steady at his sides. His voice remained calm. Because I was not raised to walk past someone who is suffering. Because sometimes the right thing to do is not the easiest thing to explain. The room was still. His words weren't dramatic or loud. They struck something deep in the people listening. Then, unexpectedly, a voice came from the crowd. A woman stood up. Her hair was gray, her eyes filled with emotion. It was the woman Blake had saved. I wasn't supposed to be here today, she said loudly. But I am, because of him. He didn't know who I was. He didn't ask for thanks. He just helped. If he hadn't, I would be dead. Is that the kind of man you punish? The judge didn't stop her. He let her speak. Another man stood up. It was a soldier who had served with Blake during the war. He saved my life in Afghanistan. The man said he carried me on his back through enemy fire, never asked for a medal. He only wanted us to make it home. More people began to speak. One after another, they stood up to share stories about Blake's kindness, his bravery, and his silence. He had never told anyone about these moments. He had never written about them or posted them online. But now, in this courtroom, the truth came out. The judge looked surprised. This was not what he had expected. He had been ready to pass judgment on a soldier who broke a rule. But now he saw something else, a man whose entire life had been about serving others quietly, without asking for reward. The prosecutor tried to bring the focus back to the rules. With respect, this is not a storybook, he said. This is a court of law. We must follow order. But the mood in the room had shifted. Then something happened that no one expected. A letter was passed to the judge's assistant, sealed. With a royal crest, the judge opened it, read it carefully, then folded it and placed it gently on his desk. He cleared his throat. This letter, he said, comes directly from the royal household. It does not give orders, but it offers perspective. He looked at Blake. It says that in times of tradition, we must not forget humanity. That true honor lies not in silence, but in compassion. And that sometimes breaking a rule is the most loyal act of all. Gasps were heard across the room. The judge took a deep breath. Mr. Blake, he said, you broke protocol. That is clear, but your reasons were not selfish. They were born from a life of service. This court will not strip you of your honors. You will not be punished. Instead, your actions will be recorded, not as a mistake, but as a reminder that even within rules, there must be room for heart. Tears welled up in the eyes of the woman who had spoken earlier. Blake nodded respectfully. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply bowed his head slightly in gratitude. The courtroom began to clear. Porters rushed out to share the news. Soldiers shook his hand. Some apologized for doubting him. But Blake didn't stay for long. He left quietly, just as he had entered. Outside, a crowd was waiting. When he appeared, people clapped, took pictures, shouted his name. A little boy ran forward and saluted him. Blake returned the salute with a warm hand on the boy's shoulder, then walked away down the street, choosing peace over fame. That night, in the silence of his room, Blake sat with the medal once more in his hand. It had been returned to him by the judge himself. But Blake knew now more than ever that the medal didn't matter. What mattered was what it stood for, doing what's right, no matter the cost. He placed the medal back in its box and closed it gently. Then he turned off the light and sat in the darkness, his heart at peace. After the court's decision, the story of Thomas Blake became a symbol of quiet strength across the nation. His name was no longer just a name, it became a message. A reminder that real courage didn't always come from shouting the loudest or standing in the spotlight. Sometimes it came from doing the right thing, even when no one expected it, even when everyone said not to. The media, which had been divided before the trial, now turned fully in his favor. News channels aired special programs about him, and newspaper headlines praised the court's decision. Guard who broke the rules to save a life becomes national hero. Read one. Another said Thomas Blake restores faith in humanity. His face, once only seen in the background of ceremonial events, was now everywhere, on television, on magazine covers, on social media. But Thomas Blake didn't want any of that. He didn't enjoy the attention. In fact, after the trial, he returned to his small flat on the edge of London and stayed mostly indoors. He still woke up early, polished his shoes, and kept his schedule as strict as when he was on duty. Old habits didn't fade easily. He didn't accept interview requests, no matter how famous the show. He didn't write a book or give a speech. People knocked on his door asking for a quote, but he politely refused. His life stayed simple, quiet, and steady, but the world around him was not quiet. The debate about the Royal Guard's rules continued. Some military leaders felt that Blake's actions had opened a dangerous door. They believed that the guards might now think it was acceptable to break formation for personal judgment. Argued that the system needed to change, that rules were meant to serve people, not control them. Letters poured in from across the country. Children sent drawings of Blake wearing his uniform and saving the woman. Veterans wrote about their own memories of service and how they wished they had shown more kindness when they had the chance. One letter stood out. It was written by a boy named Eli, just 10 years old. He wrote, "I want to be like you, Mr. Blake, because you are brave but also kind. My teacher says we should follow the rules, but you followed your heart." Read that letter over and over again. He didn't reply, but he placed it carefully on his desk. It reminded him why he had done what he did. Not for glory, not for medals, but because someone had needed help, and he had the power to give it. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. He received a call from the palace. It was not a formal message from the military. It came directly from the royal family, a quiet, respectful invitation. No details, just a date and a time. The voice on the line said only, "His Majesty wishes to speak with you." Blake was surprised. Royal meetings were rare, especially for a common soldier, even more so after such a public event. But he agreed. The next morning, he wore his uniform, freshly pressed. He took the medal from its box and pinned it to his chest. It wasn't about pride, it was about respect. The people who had trusted him, for the life he had lived, for the silence he carried, he arrived at a side entrance of the palace. No crowds, no cameras. A royal aide met him and guided him through quiet halls. The golden carpets and high ceilings did not impress Blake. He had seen war zones, refugee camps, and hospital tents filled with the wounded. He understood what was valuable and what was decoration. Finally, they reached a private room. Inside, waiting alone, stood the king. The king was older than the photos made him appear. His hair was gray at the edges, his back slightly curved, but his eyes were sharp. He smiled gently and walked toward Blake with an outstretched hand. "Mr. Blake," he said, "thank you for coming." Blake bowed respectfully, "Your Majesty." The king led him to a small table by the window, 2 chairs, a simple tea set. No guards, no advisors, just the 2 of them. "I watched everything," the king said, pouring tea for them both. "I saw the video, read the articles, followed the trial, and I waited. I wanted to see who you were when no one was looking. And what I saw impressed me deeply." Blake said nothing. He just nodded, unsure how to respond. "I served once," the king continued, sipping his tea. "Long ago, before the crown. I know what it means to be told to follow rules, even when your heart says otherwise. You did what many would not have done." Blake finally spoke. "I didn't do it to be noticed, sir. I just saw someone who needed help. And that," the king said, "is exactly why it mattered." There was a long pause. The sun streamed through the windows, painting golden patterns on the floor. The king leaned forward. "You know, sometimes even a king needs reminding that. Power means nothing without compassion. You reminded this country. You reminded me." He stood up and walked over to a small wooden cabinet, From it, he took out a small red box. He returned to Blake and placed it on the table. "This," the king said, "is a private honor. Not one that will be read in ceremonies or displayed on uniforms, but one I give personally. Not for being a soldier, not for saving a life, but for showing the country what true duty looks like." Blake opened the box. Inside was a small silver coin, engraved with the royal crest on one side and a simple message on the other, "To the one who chose right over routine." He looked at the coin, touched it gently, then looked up. "Thank you, sir. I don't have the right words." "You don't need them," the king replied. They spoke a little more about life, about service, about what it means to lead quietly. Then the king placed a hand on Blake's shoulder and said, "The world needs more people like you, not just in uniform." As Blake left the palace, the world outside felt different, not because anything had changed, but because he had been seen, truly seen, by someone who understood what he carried. In the weeks that followed, Blake received invitations from schools, charities, and organizations across the country. They wanted him to speak, to inspire, to guide young people. At first, he declined, but eventually, after deep thought, he said yes, not because he wanted to be famous, but because he realized that his silence had already spoken enough, and now his words could help others find their voice. He visited classrooms and told children about doing the right thing when no one is watching. He spoke to young cadets about leadership that begins with listening. He sat with grieving families and told them about hope. He didn't need to talk about medals or courts or palaces. He talked about one thing: humanity. Over time, even the Royal Guard quietly adjusted its training. New recruits were taught the same discipline. But also a small but powerful phrase was added to their handbook: in moments of crisis, protect life above all else. No one mentioned Blake's name in the book, but every soldier knew why that line had been added. Blake continued his life quietly. He still lived in the same flat, still took long walks in the early morning, still helped his elderly neighbors with their groceries. But now, when he walked down the street, people smiled at him not because he was famous, but because they remembered what he stood for. And sometimes when no one was around, he would take out that silver coin and read the words again: "To the one who chose right over routine." The sun was setting gently behind the clouds as Thomas Blake walked home one evening, his hands in the pockets of his coat, his steps slow but steady. It had been months since the court hearing, and life had returned to a quiet rhythm, the kind he had always preferred. The city was loud and busy as ever, but inside his world, things were peaceful in a way he hadn't known for years. He had continued visiting schools and small community centers, speaking softly to young minds who looked up at him not as a celebrity, but as someone who had stood still while the world rushed past. He didn't talk about medals, the king, or even the courtroom drama. He only shared small stories about making difficult choices, about being kind even when no one expects it, about how real strength is shown not by holding back emotion, but by knowing when to let it lead. Everywhere he went, people thanked him. Some cried, some saluted. Some just shook his hand quietly, unable to speak. One little girl had once given him a tiny handmade paper medal and said, "This one is for your heart." He had smiled and taken it home, placing it next to the real medal on his shelf. But even with all the admiration and attention, Blake never forgot why his story had begun in the first place: an old woman who had collapsed near the palace, in a moment of decision that had changed everything. He had visited her a few times after the court decision. Her name was Margaret. She had a small cottage on the outskirts of London and kept a garden full of roses. Each time he visited, she would serve tea, and they would talk about simple things: whether the flowers, her late husband, his childhood, and how strange life could be. One day she gave him a small photograph. It showed her younger self with a soldier from the Second World War, her father. He died saving another soldier. She had said, "I often wondered if anyone would ever do the same for me. And then you came." Blake didn't have words for that. He only nodded and gently put the photograph in his coat pocket. But not everything was peaceful. The background, quiet whispers had begun in the halls of the Royal Guard headquarters. A few senior officers, still uncomfortable with the attention Blake's story had brought to the force, believed it was time to change the narrative. They argued that while Blake had done something brave, he had also made the Guard look weak in the eyes of tradition. They felt that order had been challenged, and that restoring the old ways was necessary. One of them, General Mortimer, was especially vocal. He had never liked Blake. He had served in the military during harsh years, where kindness was seen as a distraction and emotions were treated like flaws. To him, discipline was everything. He believed that if even one soldier was allowed to think for himself, it would be the beginning of collapse. He called for an internal review of the Royal Guard's recent decisions and questioned the court's ruling. He couldn't overturn the verdict, but he began trying to quietly remove the changes that had been made in Blake's name, starting with the new training guideline that allowed soldiers to act on humanitarian instinct during emergencies. News of this review reached Blake through a friend still in service. At first, Blake didn't react.
Ow!
He thought perhaps it would pass. But then, letters started arriving from younger guards who had looked up to him. They were worried. Some felt pressured to stay silent. Some feared they would be punished for showing compassion in the field. The fear that Blake's actions had once removed was now slowly creeping back in. Blake knew he had to do something. He had never wanted to be a public figure, never wanted attention. But now he understood something important. If he remained silent now, everything his actions had inspired could be undone. So he made a decision. He wrote a letter not to the public, not to the newspapers, but directly to the Royal Guard Command. It was simple and humble, like everything else he did. In it, he didn't defend himself or ask for credit. He only asked one question. If rules exist to protect the people, then what do we become when we follow rules that forget humanity? Letters somehow found its way online. A young recruit, inspired by Blake, shared it anonymously. Within hours, it went viral. Thousands of people, not just in the UK, but around the world, began talking again. Hashtags like #compassion in uniform and #Blake was right trended across social media. Soldiers from other countries shared their own stories of disobeying orders to save lives. Nurses, firefighters, police officers all began discussing the delicate balance between duty and compassion. Under such public pressure, the Royal Guard had no choice but to address the issue openly. General Mortimer was asked to explain his reasoning, but his cold, hard answers didn't sit well with the public, or even with many inside the military. A younger commander, Major Helen Strauss, spoke in Blake's defense during a press conference. "We don't train robots," she said. "We train human beings." Thomas Blake reminded us what that means. The king remained silent during the discussions, but watched closely from behind the scenes. And when the time was right, he stepped forward once again, not with orders, but with a speech. He stood in front of the nation in a televised address and said, "Our history is rich with traditions, but the strength of a nation is not measured by how tightly it holds to old ways, but by how bravely it grows." Thomas Blake did not break the Royal Guard. He made it more human. And for that, we must not silence him. We must thank him. That speech settled the matter. General Mortimer retired weeks later, and the new training protocols remained in place. In fact, they were expanded. Now, every new recruit received a special module simply titled the Blake Principle, a class on how to balance duty with compassion, rules with reason, and tradition with truth. Blake never claimed credit for it. When asked, he only said, "I didn't change the Guard. I only reminded it of something it had forgotten." Time passed. A year later, a memorial was unveiled near the palace gates, a small bronze statue. Not grand, not towering, just a simple. A figure of a royal guard standing at attention, but with one hand slightly outstretched, symbolizing readiness, not just to protect, but to help. The plaque at its base read, "In honor of those who serve with both strength and heart." Blake was invited to the unveiling ceremony, but he stayed in the back, out of the spotlight. When the curtain fell and people clapped, He looked at the statue for a long time, then quietly left before the speeches began. Years later, as he grew older and eventually stepped away from public life entirely, people still remembered him. Were written, documentaries aired. But in all of them, one thing stood out: how a man who never wanted to be famous ended up changing a nation by simply doing what was right in his final years. Blake lived in a small cottage by the sea. He spent his days tending to a garden, much like Margaret's, reading books and helping neighbors with small chores. Children in the village often stopped by, knowing the legend who lived in the quiet house down the road. One day a boy asked him, "Do you ever miss being in the Guard?" Blake smiled gently and replied, "I never left it. The uniform is just cloth, but what you carry inside that stays forever." And when he passed away quietly one morning in his sleep, the country mourned not just a soldier, but a symbol. The Royal Guard held a private ceremony attended by the king, now older, but still sharp-eyed. Soldiers stood silently as a single bell rang, and then a young cadet stepped forward and laid a wreath at the statue near the palace gates. The world would go on. People would forget details, dates, headlines, but they would not forget Thomas Blake, the Royal Guard, who reminded everyone that true honor does not come from standing still. It comes from stepping forward when it matters most.